Hello there. My name is Shane McInduffer, and I'm the Director of Export Services Access for the U.S. Meat Export Federation. I work out of our global headquarters in Colorado and cover all the Western Hemisphere, plus Africa, CIS countries, and Europe. I'm excited to be with you today to talk about how U.S. beef and pork is some of the most sustainably produced meat in the world, and something you can feel good buying. Let me start by telling you a little bit about myself. I worked for USMEF for 9 years and as a third-party food safety and animal welfare auditor before that. I grew up in New Mexico, located in the southwestern United States, where we managed a few ranches before starting a custom meat slaughter business. That business is still going, about 30 years old now. Today, my day job is with USMEF, but my husband and I also run a registered cow-calf operation with Gelbvieh and Angus cattle and help with my in-laws' dryland farming operation, where we farm wheat, millet, and milo. It is very much a family affair, as I will talk more about on the next slide. You can see my daughter and husband checking our cattle during feeding, as we have to feed during the winter, since we don't grow grass in Colorado year-round. And on the left, you can see our cattle on summer pasture in the eastern plains of Colorado, part of the Great Plains that I will discuss later. I'm not sure why, but a common misconception of US agriculture seems to be that we're all big, industrial, or factory farms. I honestly don't even know what a factory farm is supposed to be. However, I can tell you that 98% of all farms in the US are family owned or operated. And those families produce about 90% of the ag outputs in the US and help to feed not only their families, but families all over the world. I think we get a bad rap because of our economies of scale and large enterprises. However, one family can run 500 mama cows, feed 30,000 cattle in a feedlot, or farm 10,000 acres. That doesn't make them factory farmers, just allows them to work at a scale that ensures they can leave something for the next generation to take over. So in summary, US farming and ranching truly is a family business. But like many places in the world, farming and ranching in the US comes under threat every single day. Urban development or other non-ag uses continue to shrink our arable land that is suitable for growing crops, and non-arable land not suitable for growing crops, but can be grazed by cattle or sheep to produce a high quality protein product. I think this map is important to show because it really highlights the need to grow and raise more with less. This is the hallmark of US agriculture. We embrace technology and innovation to make more food with less land, less natural resources, and less emissions. You can see red is the areas that have been lost to conversion to other uses, primarily urban development around our metro areas. However, I also want to use this map to show the green, yellow, and gray areas. Anywhere without green is really not suited to farming crops. In fact, a little under 1/2 of US land is not arable or suitable for any type of farming. We'll talk about this later, but this is why moving to a 100% plant-based diet is not going to benefit US greenhouse gas emissions in any significant manner. You can also see that we cannot support growing crops anywhere in the US that doesn't already grow crops. Cattle are raised in all 50 states, but their importance to the West particularly is really highlighted here. Some of these Western states, like Nevada, just do not have arable land to grow crops, but rural communities there can continue to exist because cattle or sheep provide revenue and a food source off of land that would otherwise sit unused. So US Ag has evolved to make the best of what we have in our varied geographic offerings. We have feet of topsoil and ample moisture in the Midwest, making it the most efficient row crop producing region in the world. We have dry, arid plains and desert in the West that don't support crops, but are perfect for grazing cattle and sheep. So to summarize, due to technology and innovation, we continue to feed more people with less, and efficiency equals sustainability. With advances in practices like precision agriculture and grain finishing, we continue to grow more with less water, less fertilizer use, and reduced emissions. And land that doesn't receive income from farming or grazing, it will be lost to development. And since we now know and are learning more each day that crop ground and pasture land managed in certain ways can sequester carbon or capture carbon from the atmosphere, that gives farmers and ranchers a superpower that a city just can't provide. This is why there is so much talk of carbon credits happening in the US and globally right now. Major companies like airlines and manufacturers cannot capture carbon on their own, at least the extent that forest and grasslands can, as we'll talk about later. But they can enlist farmers and ranchers, those who have been taking care of the soil for thousands of years, to do just that. In fact, we're already guardians of the land. 15% of our ag lands are already used for conservation and wildlife habitat, and that will likely increase under new incentives proposed by the White House. We also have USDA, which is our ag government agency, programs to ensure marginal crop land stays in grass and is not farmed. This arose out of the unfortunate Dust Bowl years, and we now know that just not all ground can or should be farmed. My family uses CRP to provide income on native grasslands that would be susceptible to blowing and erosion if farmed. So our government continues to recognize, again, the superpowers of farmers and ranchers to help protect thousands of acres of land in our country. I would also like to mention deforestation, as I know that is a hot topic globally when we talk about ag lands. Rest assured that US farming and ranching does not contribute to deforestation. In fact, our forests have been stable to growing for decades. We graze cattle on lands with no forests, like where I live on the prairie, and we graze them in forests in places like California, contributing to forest health. Our feed grains for cattle and hogs are all grown in the US and not imported from other countries. Okay, let's move on to some discussion on pork and beef production in the US. On the pork side, we are already world leaders in sustainable pork production. And pork production is responsible for a negligible share of total US greenhouse gas emissions, as you can see here. When talking about greenhouse gas emissions, I think one of our issues in the US is that we don't get credit for all the advances we've been making for decades. When you're already very efficient, there aren't huge changes you can make. However, continuous improvement is a key priority of this industry, and why we will be seeing hugely ambitious emission reduction targets released by the US pork industry, possibly later this year. But we have seen big gains in the past few decades, and you can see the reductions below with more to come. A huge bonus for our hog industry is that we have corn and soy right next door, literally. Many of our hog farms grow corn and or soy on site, meaning the emissions produced by transporting those feedstuffs to the animals is greatly reduced. I compare this to our large pork producing neighbors across the Atlantic who have to import many of their feed grains for their hog production. We just use the land for what it is suited for, and that amazing topsoil and moisture coming from the sky, no irrigation needed, in the Corn Belt of the Midwest is perfectly suited to produce not only ethanol for biofuel use here and globally, but also those grains to make delicious US pork. And you can see a picture here of corn right in front of a hog feeding operation. And don't forget manure. Manure gets a bad rap due to emissions. but we have seen huge strides in capturing those gases and preventing them from entering the atmosphere. But don't forget fertilizer. Half of the fertilizers used globally are livestock manure. And manure is a necessary fertilizer for those farming organically, as they can't use most synthetic fertilizers. So no animals equals no fertilizer for most of the world, and essentially all organic farm producers. Here is a tractor spreading manure from their hog farm onto their fields. Again, you can see the hog barns behind him. Less transportation-related emissions when the feed, the fertilizer, and the animals are all right there. Okay, let's talk about beef now. Here's a picture of my cows a few years ago when we had lots of rain. Unfortunately, the prairie is not green this often, but it's a nice picture to show. I want to start by saying that we are already the most sustainable beef producers in the world when looking at greenhouse gas emissions. And continuous improvement, again, less efficient producers in the world can make huge gains here, but that doesn't mean that we aren't continuously trying to get better. And feedlots, as you see in the picture, are a huge part of why we're so efficient and why countries around the world, like Australia and Argentina, are starting to utilize this practice more and more as well. So how did we become the world leader in the least emissions intensive beef? Well, there are a few factors outlined here. First is high quality feeds. Again, we are lucky to have the geography and the climate to grow corn for our signature grain finished beef. But we also use products that would go to waste, such as byproducts of corn used for ethanol production and pulp left by sugar beets after the sugar is extracted. 2, less heat stress. We select for animals that better tolerate heat. 3, improved genetics. This isn't GMO, as we don't have GMO cattle, but rather selecting for animals used for breeding that are more efficient feeders, as well as selecting for smaller framed cattle and using crossbreeding to get that hybrid bigger. 4, improved reproductive performance. Again, this is where crossbreeding comes in, as using breeds with more maternal traits means getting a calf for each cow each year. A cow just grazing and releasing methane all through her life and not producing a calf each year isn't beneficial for the rancher or the environment. And lastly, faster growth, which I will cover on the next slide. Grain finishing uses less natural resources, like water, for example, and results in less emissions because that steer heifer reaches a slaughter weight quicker, thus releasing less methane over their lifetime than a grain finished steer that may take 3 to 4 years to get ready for slaughter. I'm not bashing grass finished beef, as I'm glad when people eat beef of any kind due to the hugely beneficial nutrient density. But the fact of the matter is that when we get our animals to slaughter weight in 13 to 24 months versus 3 to 4 years, that allows for less resource use and less methane from each animal emitted over their lifetime. I say all that, but I want to clarify another common misconception on grain finished beef. Even though our beef is grain finished, making it more sustainable and extra delicious, those animals still only spend 3 to 4 months on that high energy diet. And that happens right before slaughter. Most of their lives are still spent on grass. Calves aren't born and go directly into a feedlot. But really, the impact of methane emissions from cattle is totally misguided anyway. I won't get into all the details, but I'm happy to share an excellent video later via email from UC Davis University in California, explaining why methane from ruminants being animals with multiple stomachs like cattle, bison, and sheep, have been unfairly targeted. And this focus gives emitters like transportation a free pass on their carbon dioxide emissions. But one thing I do want to tell you is that yes, methane is a very potent greenhouse gas and does warm quicker than carbon dioxide. However, methane only stays in the atmosphere around a decade. So the methane one of my cows burps out today will be gone in about 10 years. However, carbon dioxide, released from me and you driving our cars or flying or whatever, well, that carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere for about 1,000 years. So if our global cow population stays stable, we don't add any more. We don't add more methane to the atmosphere because it is a flow gas. But carbon dioxide, well, any we add today essentially stays forever, even if we keep carbon dioxide emissions stable. So what does this mean for cattle? Well, they have an amazing superpower called upcycling. What that means is that they eat plants that have taken and stored CO2 from the atmosphere. When cattle eat those plants, because ruminants can eat non-human edible plants like grass and weeds, they then convert that to a high quality human edible protein called meat. This is why ruminants are key to food production on non-arable lands. They can take those non-arable lands and eat those non-human edible plants and make food with it. In fact, 86% of all feed consumed by livestock worldwide is made up of materials that humans couldn't eat anyways. So saying livestock compete with food or cropland for humans just doesn't hold water. You can see that description a little better here, hopefully. I know it gets a bit wordy, of how cattle upcycle and really how they're not contributing their methane as it all flows back around a decade later. In addition to upcycling, grazing pressure and manure from livestock makes those plants more productive, and more productive plants sequester or capture more carbon. This is something we're learning more and more about each day. So if I asked you about the most fragile ecosystems in the world, what would you say? Maybe the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, maybe one closer to your home, like the Amazon. Well, one of the most at-risk ecosystems in the world and one of the last great remaining grasslands is located where I sit right now and smack dab in the middle of the US and Canada, the Great Plains of North America. The little red star is where I am sitting currently. So why should you care about the Great Plains? Well, prairies have the ability to store as much carbon below the ground as forests can above the ground. So that means that we shouldn't only worry about our forests, but also our world's remaining grasslands. These grasslands act as a huge vault of carbon, but without grass and plants to hold that carbon, there is no carbon sequestration. Remember me talking about pavement and concrete can't store carbon before. What does this mean for US meat, and why am I talking about it in this presentation? Well, livestock grazing improves soil health, increasing the capacity of those plants to store carbon. Again, this is because the nutrient benefits of manure, but also because grazing pressure makes those plants healthier. Think about it like this. A clump of grass never gets grazed. It doesn't have to make deep roots because nothing is going to munch on it and make it stay steady in the ground. Well, if there is grazing pressure, that plant is incentivized to grow deeper and stronger roots because nothing is, sorry, I got crossways there. That plant is incentivized to grow deeper and stronger roots to hold that plant in when it is grazed and pulled up from the ground. But those deep roots allow it to stay in the ground and only the top part is grazed off. And those roots are where most of the carbon sequestration magic happens. This has been shown in areas that grazing animals have been removed from in the name of protection. Well, those folks quickly learned that those plants weren't as healthy and couldn't compete with other weeds. This is why the benefits of grazing have been clearly shown time and time again. I am not saying overgrazing, as that can be disastrous for grasslands, but properly managed grazing has huge benefits. This picture is of the Pawnee Buttes in my area, a lookout point used by Pawnee Indians when bison roam the plains. We have less bison today, but cattle now provide that grazing pressure that bison used to provide, all while emitting less methane because we have less cattle in the US now than we had bison then. Okay, We talked about grazing and manure benefiting plant productivity and health. What else? Well, livestock hides and manure also spread seeds, a critical need for spreading plant biodiversity. Grazing lands and areas also provide wildlife habitat and corridors. I saw an antelope and her baby in one of our pastures this week, in fact. Fire mitigation. This has come up again due to the devastation of the California wildfires last year. In fact, there have been hearings recently in Washington, D.C. to highlight the benefits of grazing livestock in forest areas to help manage plant overgrowth that provides so much fuel when these fires start. Especially in states that don't allow much logging, cattle and sheep can benefit forest health, as grazing is a hugely powerful tool to help keep that undergrowth healthier and from getting overgrown in the first place. And last but not least, keeping rural America thriving. We can't farm everywhere, as you saw on that map before, but we can graze cattle in most parts of the US since they can thrive on non-arable land. This means that many rural areas that can be farmed can only provide income from the land with ranching. This picture on the left is from my home area in New Mexico. This area used to be a huge coal mining community, but as coal has been phased out, those glory days are long gone. And the top industry that remains now with land that is not suitable for crops, well, that's cattle. I grew up with families whose ancestors from Ireland started ranching here over 100 years ago. And cattle remain the thread that holds this corner of the state together. Without cattle, the small towns would die. I grew up in a town of 90 people and graduated high school with 7 kids. And the 2 businesses in the town that provided jobs, cattle and the phone company. No cattle equals millions of acres of barren land and the death of thousands of small communities in America. Okay, I want to finish with a few more common misconceptions. First, do cattle eat all the corn or other crops that could be going to humans? Nope. Last year, only 7% of all corn harvested in the US went to cattle feed, about the size of that black rectangle in the Midwest. But what about emissions and that potent methane they produce? Well, I hope you're well educated on why methane from livestock isn't the issue here. But just in case we want to add some numbers to it, US beef production only accounts for about 2% of all US emissions. And this is old data, so hopefully we have more recent stats to show you next time. So we talk about beef being bad for the environment. I don't agree with that, but talking about common misconceptions, but it is a fraction compared to other industries in regards to emissions like transportation and electricity. In fact, if all Americans stopped eating animal products, we would only see our total emissions reduced by 0.36%. And that doesn't even include the superpower farmers and ranchers have to capture carbon, like we talked about, and that global companies are going to rely on for their carbon credits. And lastly, when we look at total US agriculture and forestry emissions and sequestration data, we're already carbon negative as we store more than we emit, and we will continue to get better. Thanks again for listening to me today. You can tell I'm passionate about the prairie, so I leave you another picture of my cows doing their part for the climate and look forward to answering any questions you may have. We have amazing experts in the US who are better versed on the technicalities of greenhouse gases and emissions than I am. But if I can't answer your question, I will make sure to get you an answer after today. Thanks again.